This is something I've mentioned, George, over the course of the year on one of our shows, but I thought it was a really interesting story you guys had at PFF.com. Uh, the fragility of defense. And I think when you look at defense, people think about stars, but if you think about it logically, the offense will dictate what part of the defense they attack. And that's kind of what you guys found as you've studied how you put together a good defense.
Yeah, I feel like almost a broken record because I keep saying this is my favorite article from the past year, and it's not a surprise that Eric Eager wrote it because he just does a fantastic job of pinpointing these really interesting studies and then attacking them. And that was exactly kind of the genesis of this thought, was looking at defenses and saying, okay, people make a really big deal out of, let's take Khalil Mack going to the Chicago Bears, because Khalil Mack is an awesome player. In fact, on, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, I was talking to Mitchell Schwartz, and I said, who's the best pass rusher in the NFL? And he said Khalil Mack. But you look at the teams that they're on, and Aaron Donald's another really good example. T.J. Watt was our highest graded edge rusher last season, another great example, on teams that do not end up winning a ton of games. And so why is that? Why is the reason that these incredible defensive players are unable to kind of raise their team up? And one of the ideas is that singular stars on defense just can't impact a game the way, maybe a quarterback or even a receiver can, because of what you just said, right? There are so many things that the offense controls, and particularly attacking weak links on the defense. So when you think about it, kind of across the defense, one of the places that really stands out is in coverage, because that's where in the passing game, the offense can absolutely dictate where they attack and generally causes the most damage, because in today's NFL, that's the passing game is really what wins. And it's really common sense to just think about, okay, if I have 4 defensive backs on the field or 5 defensive backs on the field, and one of them can't cover a $5 check, then that's where the offense is going to go. I mean, how often have we seen Tom Brady pick on the weakest coverage linebacker or the weakest, safety in coverage by attacking the slot? It just happens all the time. And so what Eric looked at was how basically the skill or ability of different members of the defense impacts, what we would expect to happen in the game. And it turns out that, like, your third best corner, I don't want to give away the whole thing, go read the article, but basically the thing that I always tell people is your third corner is just as important as your first corner. Like, if not more, like if your third corner can't cover anybody, then you're going to get torched, because offenses nowadays have a guy or have a way to put that guy in coverage against someone they want to attack. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about building a defense. When you look at the New England Patriots, how have they done it? They have like 5 different defensive backs, maybe 6, that they can throw out there in a situation that they're prepared to cover somebody and cover them well. They have not spent money on singular defensive stars on the defensive line. And a lot of their linebackers that they put in positions are either kind of specialty pass rushers, or they're put in coverage for a reason, because they can cover. So it really sheds a light on how you should build a defense in today's NFL, and on why some teams kind of expect these singular defensive stars to really improve their team and then are let down year after year.
When people talk about pressure on quarterbacks, the amount of times they get sacked, the fingers always get pointed at the offensive line, right? They go, the offensive line's not good enough, letting people get to the quarterback, not good. But you guys have found that pressure and sack rates have a lot more to do with the quarterback than it has to do with the guys in front of him, right?
It shouldn't be too surprising to people once you kind of think about it a little bit, and maybe think about it from the perspective of an offensive lineman, who, by the way, offensive linemen are awesome. Like, they are just fun. They're great people to hang
they're the
around.
Best. They're the best.
They're the best. They're fantastic. And if you're an offensive lineman, people notice. When you get noticed as an offensive lineman, that's a bad thing, right? Because you get noticed because you get beat and you give up a sack. Your job as an offensive lineman is really just to, like, go unnoticed, right? If no one calls your name, for an entire game, you're probably in good shape. That means you haven't done anything bad.
Same thing with cornerbacks, my friend.
Exactly. And so, if you think about it from their perspective, if you go, okay, I'm a offensive lineman. If I do my job, I've blocked the blocker for 2.5 seconds. And at that point in time, depending on the play call, I expect the ball to be out. And so what can really impact whether a quarterback is taking a sack or getting pressure is how long they're holding onto the ball. And I say quarterback, I'm also throwing in a little bit of scheme, right? That part of that is, hey, how long developing are your plays going to be? But you can do things to mitigate that, like play action, which generally buys you a couple extra tenths of a second. But for the quarterback, having the ball in their hands is a huge, that is the ultimate, kind of decision maker. And so when you hold onto the ball for 0.2 of a second longer than your offensive line is trying to block or doing their job in blocking for that amount of time, you've all of a sudden incurred a lot higher probability of taking on pressure and therefore of taking on a sack. So the quarterback really should own a large amount of the pressure rate and a large amount of their sack rate. And Timo found that taking sacks is, from a quarterback's perspective, really something of a skill. And a guy like a Patrick Mahomes, who he doesn't avoid pressure at a particularly great rate, but he does not take sacks. He took sacks last season about 6% less often than you'd expect, which is ridiculous. Whereas a guy like maybe a Ryan Tannehill, who had a really high sack rate last year, he kind of held on to the ball for a little bit. He's not the most elusive guy on the planet, and he took sacks at a rate higher than we would have expected given kind of the situational factors that he had. So taking sacks, interestingly, no one would ever guess this, right? But sacks are almost more indicative of a quarterback skill than they are a defensive lineman skill, right? Because we have a way to measure defensive lineman skill with pressures that are more indicative of how good they are as a pass rusher. For a quarterback, taking sacks and avoiding sacks is a skill.
Final one before we get to Jones specifically. Predictive stats for quarterbacks. This is something that I think is interesting when you try to predict success for a quarterback from year to year, and even from college to the pros when you're trying to figure out, what quarterbacks are going to be good. So what did you guys find is the best way to figure out whether a quarterback was lucky in a year, whether or not he was truly good, and whether or not that's going to continue? What type of numbers should you be looking at?
Yeah, this is also kind of counterintuitive for most because of what we see. So if you're watching, the highlights of the game, you're going to see the really impressive plays, right? You might see, if you're watching a Chiefs game, Patrick Mahomes running from left to right and then making a spin move and going back to the right and throwing it across the field. And you go, man, that's amazing. And it certainly is. But those plays are small sample plays. And they're also, big plays, big positive plays oftentimes take a confluence of things going right? The receiver has to get open. You can't have an offensive lineman completely blow a block, all these things. So you want to look at the pieces that are really repeatable for a quarterback. And the things that tend to be the most repeatable are avoiding negative plays. And so we grade, obviously, every play. And some plays get a negative grade, some plays get a positive grade. And if you think about negatively graded plays, those are throws where, look, you should be able to put the ball on the money, but you make a throw that's just uncatchable. The receiver can't possibly catch it. That's a hugely negative thing because you need to give your receiver a chance, right? Another example would be holding the ball too long and taking a sack, right? You talked about how negative that is. It's incredibly bad for your team. But those are things that we find to be pretty consistent for quarterbacks. Avoiding negative plays is a quarterback trait. And so if I'm looking at things that predict how good a quarterback will be going forward, I actually want to look at how well they avoid negative plays instead of how well they created positive plays. Because we've seen positive play rates fluctuate a lot depending on, are your receivers healthy? Did you have a functioning offensive line? There's all these little factors that can come into play. But avoiding negative plays is something that is by far a quarterback trait. And so that's the first place I look. The second thing I look is how does a quarterback perform in a clean pocket? because not only does that happen more frequently, but it's also something that can be practiced, right? You are practicing the reads and the play design, assuming, look, I'm going to be able to get 2.5 or 2.7 or 2.8 seconds to throw. And so when you see that happen in a game, that's something that's indicative of what the quarterback has been able to practice and been able to repeat. And so that tends to be far more stable than play under pressure. So those are the two places that I would start off with.
And surprisingly enough, those are two places that we're going to go when we talk about Daniel Jones here. So let's start here, George. I basically watched every snap over the last month. I looked at every advanced stat you guys have on PFF, sorting through situations and everything like that. And this is the kind of overall conclusion I came to, and then we'll get to some of the specific stuff in a moment. And this is to the point you just made, if you watch Daniel Jones's highlight reel, you're like, damn, this guy's an elite quarterback. Like, some of the amazing throws he makes, you're like, wow, that's pretty darn fantastic. But the consistency of it, obviously, is something. And then the negative plays that go along with it. So a lot of his greatest strengths, putting balls into small spots, playing well in the face of pressure, standing in the pocket, throwing in the face of pressure. These are all things that are positives for a quarterback, but they lead to too many negative plays. So for him, cutting down on those negative plays has to be the focus. And is it easier for a quarterback to do that earlier in their career? I mean, once you set a baseline, I imagine it's harder for the quarterback to kind of emerge from that. We've seen that with Jameis Winston, right? But do you think for a younger quarterback with only 12 games under his belt that improving in that area, avoiding those negative plays, is something that Jones can do in year two?
Yeah, I was, it's timely that we're talking because I am working on kind of ranking the sophomore quarterbacks going into 2020 for an NFL Network kit. And I was thinking, I was looking at Daniel Jones, and, everyone kind of likes to think that we were hating on Daniel Jones in the draft process. And I thought he was overdrafted, but I in no way looking for the negatives. I was looking for the positives. And you hit the nail on the head in terms of, look, he had too many really bad plays last year. He was 33rd out of 35 quarterbacks in turnover-worthy play rate. And by the way, you could get all of these numbers that I'm referencing in our quarterback annual with the PFF Edge subscription. I have to throw that out there.
No, of course.
I use this thing all the time. It's a great way to prepare for the season.
George, by the way, I have it printed out sitting on my desk at work. I do. It's great.
There you go. I don't have it printed out in large part because I don't have a printer, but it is one of the many tabs that is almost always open, along with way too many Google Docs and Google Sheets. But you hit the nail on the head there. So turnover-worthy play rate, think about, and this is the way I explain it to people, either a throw that should be intercepted, and sometimes it isn't caught, sometimes it is, but we grade it the same way because we grade the process, not the result, or like a really bad fumble. And that's a place where Daniel Jones really struggled, right? He had some really not great fumbles. Even think about that Tampa Bay game, which everyone, just continued to reference because of how well he played under pressure and, the kind of heroism in that game that we saw. But, there was a really bad fumble in that game, and that was an issue for DJ last year. But turnover-worthy plays are still a very small portion of the overall, body of work that a quarterback has. And when I look at all negatively graded plays that include, less dire throws, right, just uncatchable throws that aren't in danger of being intercepted, but were uncatchable, bad sacks, that, look, they happen a little more frequently than a fumble will. He actually was 15th out of 35 quarterbacks in avoiding negatively graded plays.
Wow. Okay.
So that gives me some hope there that, I would negatively graded plays as a whole are far more stable than turnover-worthy plays. Now, that being said, it's never a good thing to see, a guy like you mentioned, Jameis Winston, right, who makes a ton of, what are you doing throws. But I would be more worried if they were reversed. I would be more worried if those two rankings were flip-flopped because we've just seen mathematically that turnover-worthy play rate is something that fluctuates a lot more than just their overall rate of making negative plays.
Interesting. And by the way, if you break down those 31 turnover-worthy plays, 10 were fumbles. And he had, by the way, about 4, let me think, I think he had 8. And that shows you that sometimes he just got sacked really quick, had some bad luck, got hit as he threw. He had 8 fumbles that you guys did not credit to him as turnover-worthy plays. So that's a fair amount of fumbles. So that means there was some bad luck involved there, and you can improve ball protection. I think he had 9 dropped interceptions, which I think is something that kind of gets overlooked a little bit. And you brought up the accuracy there, George. And to your point, you guys track accuracy, and again, you can find all this on PFF.com. He was in the top half of the league in avoiding uncatchable passes. But a number where I think he was a little bit too high is passes that you kind of term catchable but inaccurate. So it was on the frame, the receiver can make the play, but maybe you give the defensive player a chance to get the football. Maybe you limit run after the catch. So in terms of precision accuracy, to me at least, that's where you can see Jones get a little bit better. He's good at putting the ball on the receiver, maybe just be a little bit more precise.
Yeah, this was literally a conversation that Eric and I were having about Daniel Jones because, look, he was under pressure 42% of his dropbacks. Now, that's not all his offensive line's fault, as we have discussed. His average time to throw was above the league average, about 2.9 seconds from snap to pass, and the league average about 2.7. 0.2 of a second there, by the way, is a lot.
It's significant.
That's a big difference.
Yeah.
Like 0.2 of a second, below the average is about the fastest that any quarterback will have. And I think it's usually Drew Brees. Eli Manning was always up there, actually. He always got rid of the ball quickly for, a variety of different reasons. But I think Daniel Jones had a little bit of fearlessness that endeared people to him for obvious reasons. Like that's a cool thing to have as a quarterback, especially, after kind of some of the things that Manning went through at the end of his run in New York. So I understand that. I would say one of the places where I would look to see that pinpoint accuracy show up is if you're taking the pressure rate down, if you're getting the ball out of the hands quickly, are you able to make more pinpoint throws because you're a little more comfortable, you're getting the ball out more quickly, you're not worried about pressure, showing up and derailing your ability to make a clean throwing motion. So that would be a place that I'd be keenly looking this year. Are we seeing that rate of what we deem accurate passes? So that's basically a throw that's on the receiver's frame. It might not be perfectly in stride, but it's not something that I'm, adjusting as a receiver dramatically to catch. Or is that rate going up? Because as you mentioned, he was in the bottom third of the league in making accurate throws, but he did at least avoid the kind of, the ones that you can't live with, which are the uncatchable throws. So it'll be a very interesting season. I mean, you draft Andrew Thomas, a guy that PFF loved. He was our offensive tackle number 1 in the draft. So you hope, that improves a little bit. I would look definitely to take that time to throw down to try and mitigate the pressure numbers there. And then you have to rely on some receivers. And, if you throw Saquon Barkley in there, I'd have him running way more routes, and some of the tight ends, to get open, because that ultimately is going to decide a lot of things, right? You can only make positive throws if they're there to be had, is kind of what I always think about, and so they need to be there for Daniel Jones to make them.